Hello, and welcome to another episode of DW FastTrack, the podcast where lawyers discuss all things legal and trending. I'm Dan Cotter, a partner in Dickinson Wright PLLC's Chicago office, with colleague Michael Beckwith, a partner in our firm's Silicon Valley office. We are going to discuss the United States Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, and how it works, and things you as a business should be looking out for. My experience includes more than half of my career in-house at large insurance organizations where my duties included oversight and advising on OFAC-related issues. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. I'm Mike Beckwith with Dickinson Wright's Silicon Valley office. I'm currently focused on internal investigations, white-collar defense, and AML and BSA issues. Before joining Dickinson Wright, I was a former assistant United States attorney and chief of the transnational organized crime unit in the Eastern District of California.
Well, recent events over the last several decades, including 9/11 and cybersecurity hacks, have raised focus on the work of OFAC. It is nothing new. In 2024, OFAC assessed almost $49 million in penalties and has blocked multi-billion-dollar transactions.
The Office of Foreign Asset Control was established to enforce economic trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security. Officially created in 1950 within the Treasury Department following the entry of China into the Korean War, it was focused on financial transactions and enforced economic and trade sanctions. Now, the Treasury Department has had a long history of dealing with sanctions. For the War of 1812, Treasury administered sanctions imposed on Great Britain for the harassment of American sailors. And during the Civil War, Congress imposed or approved laws that prohibited transactions with the Confederacy. And OFAC's successor, the Office of Foreign Fund Control, or the FFC, was established and used during the German invasion of 1940. The FFC's initial purpose was to prevent Nazis from using an occupied country's holdings and financial assets and to prevent forced repatriation. So the use of economic sanctions is a significant part of our nation's history. They're tied to our foreign policy and national security and serve as a potent form of economic power projection, especially when used in concert with allies. So bottom line here is that they're not going anywhere.
OFAC derives authority from the Trading with the Enemies Act and other U.S. laws. As Michael just mentioned, it's been around for some period of time, and its predecessors as well. OFAC focuses on what's known as prohibited transactions with certain countries or individuals and nationals. The countries in sanctions can vary by program and on relationships with various countries. The U.S. maintains a comprehensive trade embargo against Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, and the Crimea region of Ukraine.
So now let's talk a little bit about some of OFAC's key responsibilities and functions. And basically, we're going to run through a quick list here. They administer sanctions programs. They maintain and update the specially designated nationals, or SDN list. They enforce compliance actions across financial institutions and businesses, which include banks and casinos. They play a role in countering terrorism, drug trafficking, and other threats.
OFAC also maintains a list of specially designated nationals. OFAC publishes a list of individuals and companies owned or controlled by or acting for on behalf of targeted countries. It also lists individuals, groups, and entities, such as terrorists and narcotics traffickers, designated under programs that are not country-specific. Collectively, such individuals and companies are called specially designated nationals, or as Michael already mentioned, SDNs. Companies doing business, even if entirely within the United States, must understand OFAC and how it works.
Individuals or entities may be included on the OFAC sanction list for a number of reasons, including most commonly narcotics trafficking or terrorism. But also of significant concern to OFAC would be the proliferation of nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction, human rights violations, and more recently, cyber-related issues. Most designated persons will be added to the OFAC list based on procedures established by OFAC, and these persons on the SDN list are known as blocked persons. So generally speaking, there's a three-pronged approach to designating someone, putting them on the SDN list. And unlike what we might see in normal cases, here there is an overlay of actual evidence that you might see at trial. but also there's an overlay of politics and then national security intelligence. So a lot of classified information. So those three things, evidence, politics, and intel, combine together to create a package which will go before a panel. If that panel decides that someone should be on the list or an entity should be on the list, they will be listed. So generally speaking, anyone on the SDN list will be prohibited from transacting with anyone on the list or any entity that anyone on the list owns more than 50% of.
And this list is very extensive and growing, and it includes a lot of variants of names. It is important to have a process and or service in place to screen customers, especially in the financial services, insurance, instant payment industry, and virtual currency industries. If an SDN or sanctioned country is involved, you must obtain a license from OFAC before accepting money or paying out money to anyone on the list.
So now let's kind of turn to how sanctions work. So sanctions, generally speaking, there are two types, either comprehensive or targeted, and they're carried out through a combination of statutes, regulations, executive orders, and interpretive guidance. So it's fairly complex, it's fairly fact specific, and it's one of these things that you really have to kind of dig into, but you can get a general sense from the statutes, the regulations, and then who actually is on the SDN list and what active sanction programs are currently in play. And currently, OFAC has about nearly 40 active sanction programs. But as I mentioned before, the primary sanctions are comprehensive and targeted. Comprehensive, many people know as an embargo. It generally prohibits all transaction or trades with a specific country or region. And currently, as I think Dan mentioned earlier, the best or the most familiar would include Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and certain parts of Ukraine. So comprehensive sanctions are broader and they're region or country based. Targeted sanctions relate to a specific person or entity, and usually they relate to a particular jurisdiction or activity. So some examples of targeted sanctions would include, and this is public information, it's all available on OFAC's website, Herman Greff, former head of Sberbank, the third largest bank in Europe, the largest bank in Russia, is on the SDN list. Certain Russian oil tankers you heard of recently have been put onto the SDN list. Certain companies that support Russian oil and gas industry, for example, those who have recently been put onto the SDN list, they're examples of targeted sanctions.
And the mechanisms for enforcement by OFAC, which is underneath the Treasury, include freezing of assets in certain cases. And as Michael mentioned on the comprehensive sanctions, that's if you're doing business with those specific countries and those specific frameworks. Also prohibiting trade. And in the financial services industry and the insurance industry, it includes not being able to pay claims on the insurance side, for example, or if you've accepted premiums. And the compliance challenges for businesses are many. One of the challenges of OFAC is, as Mike and I will talk about, the list continues to grow. The sanctions sometimes change under different administrations. And this list is pretty comprehensive, especially post 9/11. Many names and organizations were added to the list. There have been some cyber state actors and programs that have been added in recent years. And so the compliance challenge for businesses is really navigating this area and making sure that you do not run afoul of the OFAC regime and framework. Let's turn to compliance and penalties. The importance of compliance for companies and financial institutions is manyfold. One is a reputational damage that can be implemented against companies. Fines are reported. The OFAC webpage does include companies or individuals that have been sanctioned for various violations under OFAC. And it's important to comply. As we talked about, the amount is pretty significant in terms of fines and penalties. It's also something that if you do, in fact, get in the middle of a situation where you may have paid a specially designated national or company, that you have to deal with the U.S. government and figure out how you go about freezing of the assets and segregating of assets. Penalties for noncompliance, again, are fines and reputational damage to the company, as well as potential stoppages of the ability for financial institutions and insurance companies, especially, to be able to transact business and have special holds put in place. The fine turn on a number of factors, including willfulness and self-reporting, and whether you've talked to OFAC before getting into the situation, and if you've had communications.
I'm just going to touch briefly, Dan, on then some of the more recent fines that we've seen. In 2023, they were very busy. It was a big year. I think there was over $1.5 billion issued in fines. A lot of that was due to the Binance settlement, but that was over 900 million in fines. 2024, they've still been active, although the fines have been smaller. But I think some of the, touching on some of the enforcement actions highlights the interest, which I think will continue in the new administration. And so we've seen companies receiving fines of 20 million, 14.5 million. And those two instances were a violation of Iranian sanctions, which we'll talk about in a second here, which is of particular interest to this administration and was highlighted in some of the recent DOJ memos that I mentioned before. We also saw State Street Bank and one of its subsidiaries receive a $7.4 million fine for violation of Ukrainian and Russian sanctions, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But we recently saw the enactment of significant sanctions by the Biden administration on their way out. And then when Secretary Bessent was going through his confirmation hearing, he said that additional sanctions would be likely in the context of Russia and Ukraine. And we'll talk about that a little more, but I think it's a focus that we need to be aware of. And then we saw another company that received $3.5 or $3.7 million fine for violation of Cuban sanctions. Now, as Dan mentioned or alluded to, if you are dealing with an SDN, or also called a blocked person, or an entity that may be subject to sanctions, you can, through a process with OFAC, seek a license to engage in transactions with these blocked persons or entities. But that's an involved process, and it involves kind of stepping out and saying, hey, we're dealing with this blocked entity, and kind of bringing that to OFAC's attention. With that said, I'll turn it back over to Dan for some practical business tips.
Thank you, Mike. And one of the things that listeners should understand is that application process can take some time. And again, if depending on the transaction, things that can put some wrinkles into a transaction flow, but you need to be aware of those. The few practical tips for businesses. First is that you need to conduct a regular SDN list checkup. There are software solutions out there that will scrub against these, and with the name variations and other factors, it's important. One of the things that we mentioned, Iran and Cuba and some other locations, and one of the things that oftentimes causes this to be triggered is shipments of products from one place. There are very strict rules in terms of ships being able to port into Cuba and then come to Florida or other places in the United States. That's deemed to be a potential trigger of OFAC. So you need to conduct those regular checkups and make sure you understand the flow of goods and funds that are coming to your business. Second is you need to train employees on compliance best practices, just like any compliance framework. Employees with knowledge and understanding and making sure that they're aware of their obligations to perform certain inquiries is outstanding, depending on the type of role they have. Third is to leverage technology to manage compliance risk. Again, there's software that will identify potential hits, and then oftentimes they're false hits because there's a lot of common names or somewhat common names that are on the long list of SDNs. And then finally, like with any compliance overlay and some of the fines that Mike talked about earlier, and the substantial fines in 2023, and who knows what fines will look like year over year. But you should seek legal and professional advice for complex situations and make sure that you really understand what's taken place and have a good, robust knowledge of your customers and clients. With that, Mike, I'll turn it back to you for some current events and trends.
There have been, I think, some pretty good signals from the current administration, and we can look to the past as well as potential prologue, and so there's value in that, but also this administration has kind of signaled a consolidated focus on a certain set of areas, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't start off with the fact that Iranian sanctions and sanctions against Venezuela have been kind of reimposed and intensified. With regard to Venezuela, they're looking at the oil sector. state-owned entities. But with regard to Iran, this is particularly interesting. And so there's been a long history with regard to the United States and Iran and the use of sanctions. But with the October 7th attack by Hamas into southern Israel and other parts, there's a recent memo that just came out, and the current administration has kind of signaled an intensified focus on Hamas. And so in this new memo that came out, the DOJ, Department of Justice, is standing up Task Force 10-7, which is a reference to the October 7th attack by Hamas into Israel. They're focused on investigating funding for Hamas. Traditionally, there's been a strong connection between Iran and Hamas. And so this administration is taking efforts to redirect resources to look at Iranian sanctions and then any money moving to Hamas. So they may be starting with Hamas, but we think the first step out of there in many instances will be Iran. So financial institutions, including banks in particular, must look for and be aware of these sanctions and kind of involved in the analysis of whether or not they're involved or are facilitating, similar transactions. We mentioned Cuba, and this administration has rescinded their removal from a list that the prior administration took them off of, which is a state-sponsored terrorism list. So they were removed, they're now back on. So that's probably a pretty good indicator that Cuba sanctions will still remain in place, the embargo will remain in place. I think another point we really want to emphasize and underscore is that this administration has designated cartels and transnational criminal organizations. Many of them, have been designated now as sanctioned entities. And so this opens up a whole nother legal approach for the government to go after cartels with. I think many of you may be very familiar with an executive order that came out and talked about this, but now the February 5th series of memos that came out from the Department of Justice has again highlighted this. And so you have the executive branch making a broad policy statement in a presidential order, but you now have the Department of Justice allocating resources, and they've looked at the total elimination of drug cartels. And that means not just the movement of drugs and guns in kind of the blue collar sense, but also the billion-dollar industry that funds and the reason why these cartels operate. They want to attack the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure of a billion-dollar industry. And so that will involve sanctioning these entities and then holding financial institutions such as banks and casinos in particular accountable for the movement of cartel funds. They also talk about transnational criminal organizations, and those are broader than just cartels that operate across borders. They include human trafficking, but they also include Chinese money laundering. And so we're going to see, I think, a lot of, especially in the Pacific Rim on the West Coast of the United States, we're going to see a lot of work by the government in the area of Chinese money laundering to track, the movement of funds around the globe that these organized groups participate in, and the movement of money that they participate in. So we also see some kind of geopolitical issues. We've touched on these already with the war in Ukraine. As I mentioned before, the Biden administration recently, on their way out, issued a series of sanctions against the oil and gas industry for Russia. And that was not just against Russian entities, but also companies that support and kind of establish the logistical framework for that industry. And also, I think there was 187 specific targeted sanctions against oil tankers, the so-called shadow fleet. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, during his confirmation hearing when he was incoming, acknowledged that there may actually be an increase to the sanctions, levied by the Biden administration. And so fair question as to how long these sanctions are in place, and fair question as to whether or not they would be used as a negotiating or a bargaining chip in settling the conflict. But for now, those sanctions are in place. And the indication from this administration is that those sanctions in the Russian and Ukraine area will be continued and strengthened. So we're going to talk about a couple other areas, and one of them I think we touched on is cybersecurity. And so Dan, I kind of want to just throw it over to you on that area, and why has that grown with regard to sanctions?
Sure, thanks, Mike. In September of 2021, OFAC issued its updated advisory on potential sanctions risk for facilitating ransomware payments. And that update outlines sanctions and advises of several actors added to the specially designated list. The cyber-related sanctions program implemented by the Office of Foreign Assets Control began actually on April 1st, 2015, when the president issued Executive Order 13694 and declared a national emergency to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States, constituted by the increasing prevalence and severity of malicious cyber-enabled activities originating from or directed by persons located in whole or in substantial part outside the United States, and it's an increasing constant battle with these cyber actors.
I think it's important, Dan, that we point out that the United States government strongly discourages all private companies and citizens from paying any of these ransomware demands generally. But I think more to the point for this discussion is that even if your payment is in response to a ransomware demand, and that payment goes to someone or an entity on the SDN list or touches on one of the active sanctions programs, that can be a violation of federal law as well. So generally speaking, you don't want to, the government will push back against making these payments, but those kind of payments may also be actually a violation of law. So you need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. I want to give a few key takeaways for listeners. One is, as we've been talking about this podcast, this is a complex and ever-changing kind of framework, and with the new administration, as you mentioned, there's some focused and refocused activities. I mean, this can be changed depending on what happens with other countries around the world and with other threats, including cyber, like you said, the cartels. And so, again, the challenges are you want to make sure you're in compliance with this. You don't want that kind of $900 million penalty that was put on Binance. This can be time consuming and lead to a lot of additional costs and exposure for companies, including reputationally. Listeners should engage with compliance efforts and stay informed. This is an ever changing area. People will be added to the list, cartels and other things. So you need to stay informed and make sure that you're on top of this, because transaction or two can then lead to that letter or call from the government that you potentially have violated OFAC. Mike, in the remaining few minutes, let's talk about considerations for OFAC and also BSA enforcement.
So I think these are very closely related topics. We've been talking about, for example, sanctions related to Iran, cartels, Russia. Well, there's going to be a lot of money moving around the globe. And in many of those, maybe most of those transactions will probably be fine. But some of them may involve money coming from Iran, cartels, other transnational organized criminal operations, or from some of those Russian entities on SDN lists. And so the way to I think for companies to kind of protect themselves, and especially with the new focus of this administration on Iran, cartels, and Russia, is to develop a solid compliance program. In doing that, this is where these kind of become very closely connected to your BSA compliance program or your AML compliance program. Those compliance programs, ones that identify sanction transactions, ones that identify or help to identify money laundering transactions or BSA violations, all of that is taken into consideration by OFAC when looking at a particular case. And so if there is, a company in the money services business that has broad-based customer base across the globe, but no compliance program, that's going to say one thing to OFAC. Whereas if you have a robust compliance program and you're building in to a certain extent a good faith defense. And so our encouragement to companies is one, have a compliance program that addresses sanctions, the BSA, AML issues, but also keep that updated and tested. And when you do that, I think that's one of the things that OFAC and other regulators will look at in a very positive light. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this episode of DW Fast Track. For more information, please visit our website at www.dickinsonwright.com. or check out our social media channels.